Hello, welcome to Grom's Cauldron. I'm your host Riker, and today I'm going to be discussing the way that I was introduced to Warhammer 40,000. I had seen the game every now and again during high school from a select few people, but I had never played the game until I had gotten out of high school. For context, I had gotten into the game during the very early stages of 9th edition. During this time, I was thinking about starting an army, which would later be the beginnings of a massive Khornate army. But that's not what's to be discussed today. The story takes place for the very first game of 9th edition I've been through, which almost steered me away from the game entirely. Now, on to that story. So, how this story begins. Again, this was at the very early stages of 9th edition, so balance wasn't much of a thing, and the Death Guard Codex had just come out. As such, my friend, who we'll call Michael for this story, was super stoked to play as them, and even more stoked that I was considering getting into the game. So, Michael invited me over to his place, and we sat down for a test drive of a game. A very rocky test drive. What he didn't tell me was that we were going to be having a third player, which we'll be calling Ryan. No big deal though, right? The more the merrier, I always say. So the three of us sat down at Michael's kitchen table, and one glaring issue, in hindsight, but didn't click with me back then, was that we didn't have any terrain on the table. Sure, he didn't own any, but the idea of nothing on the table except for our miniatures concerns me after learning what I know. Anyways, Michael wanted it to be a three-way match, which even as a new player, really concerned me. It seemed like it was going to be a very hectic game, which by all accounts, it absolutely was. So, we had gotten our miniatures set up and ready to go. Points value is uncertain, but the armies went as follows. Michael was playing an Imperial Guard army, with a heavy focus on artillery. Ryan was playing a Death Guard force, and I was playing the Necrons for the recently released Indominus box. It appeared even back then, Michael's force was much larger than mine and Ryan's. I didn't ask anything about it back then, because, well, it was my first game. I later realized that was a little bit of a mistake, but hindsight's 2020, right? Anyways, on to the game. For the game. I didn't really get a rundown of the rules before we started, so we skipped straight to deployment. We ended up rolling off to see who went first, and I got to deploy first. As such, I stood silent for a second, and just picked up a model and put it onto the table. I started on the second model, and Michael said, "You have to wait for everyone else before you place your second model, or unit. It's alternating deployment." A little confused, I just let him go on. And then Ryan deployed. And then finally, I got to deploy my second model, and then deployment went on that way for a bit, until we were all ready to play. Then we rolled off to see who got to go first. And so Michael went first. Once again, he had brought an artillery-heavy guard list. So since my force was quite small, he started to shell into my Necron warriors. Almost the entire unit had gotten wiped out before I even got into play. Due to the way turn order went, Ryan got to go next after that. Ryan killed off a few more of my models and started to move into Michael's infantry squads. Ryan had charged a Plague Marine squad into Michael's Krieg Grenadiers. This portion becomes important later. So, combat ensued between the two units, neither side gaining the upper hand, equal casualties being taken on both sides. After combat, it went on to my turn, battle shock not being a factor for this game. I moved my Necrons up the table. And declared I was going to shoot into Michael's Krieg Grenadiers to get revenge for the casualties that had been caused earlier in the game. Specifically the Grenadiers that were in combat with the Plague Marines. After I declared my shots, Michael told me that I couldn't. I asked why, and he simply responded, "It's in the rules. Units that are engaged with other units can't be shot at." I told him if that was the case, I would like to move my models and units in a different way. He said no to that request, and at this point I had started to feel down about the game in general. I was just ready to have the game ended so I could go back home. I tried a few more shots in different units all the same, and didn't manage to inflict many wounds at all. Feeling demoralized, I ended my turn. It's on to Michael's turn, and boy was it a doozy. He shot all of his artillery once again into my Necrons, and wiped out a further half of them off the board. I only had about 2 warriors and 1 character left on the board, compared to his 2, almost, full squads of Krieg Grenadiers, 2 Commissars, and 4 artillery pieces I don't exactly remember the names of. And Ryan's 7 Plague Marines, 2 characters, and 20 Poxwalkers. After this point, I called it quits. I left the models on the table and went over to Michael's couch and just chilled out on my phone and was prepared to simply not play the game again at all. Which almost became the case until I started to look through the Khorne model range, then their playstyle, and then I was hooked. I'll tell you about the story about my Khorne game soon enough, but until then, that was my first ever game of Warhammer 40k. It was absolutely demoralizing. After that game, though, I had learned enough over the span of the next month to start teaching others how to play the game, which I'll step into that story once again later. But until then, the taking away I really want people to see in this story is for them to communicate better about how the game is actually played. 40k is a very, very complex system. Honestly, much more complex than it needs to be. Back in 9th edition especially. 10th edition, which is the current edition, is a little less complex. But a little less complex than rocket science is still probably rocket science. And if you're trying to get a friend into Warhammer 40k, be straightforward and honest with them. Show them how points, lists, and the rules work. Show them through the phases before you even have them start playing the game. And during the game, go on ahead and take first turn just to show them how the phases are done and how they work. The do's and don'ts of the phases and explain why things are the way they are. Help and communicate with the person you're wanting to play with and see where they'd want to start. At the end of the day, we want this hobby to grow and flourish. So if you're a veteran player, or heck, even a newer player, hearing that someone wants to try to get into the game, try to help them the best you can. Understand it won't be a smooth process, sometimes due to how the system works, but know that if things go well, you may have just made yourself a new friend. Again, this was more of a shorter story on the don'ts of how to get someone into 40k. All that said, thank you and watching for listening to my story. There'll be more later, but for the time being, I hope you enjoyed hearing one man's story. Later, I'll run through how to play the game for beginners and refreshers for players returning to the hobby. Of course, do the YouTube things if you want to see more, and if you stay around, I hope to see you next time.